The elderly man entered the courtroom in handcuffs, his weathered face lowered. "Name?" asked the judge. He answered with a trembling voice, "Mason Quinn, Sergeant, United States Marine Corps." No one expected what would happen next. A few minutes later, as the judge went through her file, she suddenly froze. Her face lost all color. This name belonged to the man who had saved the life of her brother on the battlefield of Fallujah before he made the ultimate sacrifice. Respect if you believe that honor does not fade, just because we get old or poor. Mason Quinn, 69 years old, sat on the bench in the courtroom. His shoulders hung under an old military jacket that was 2 sizes too large. The bright neon lights emphasized deep creases that had once been dug into his proud face through the years and the hardships of life. Decades ago, he had stood upright in his service uniform, with medals on his chest. Today he was waiting for the judgment and clothes that came from a donation box of the homeless shelter. The judge called his case. File 47B, City against Mason Quinn, disturbance of public order, house peace breach, resistance against the arrest. Mason pushed forward, his movements stiff with arthritis and old injuries that had never been properly healed. Vietnam first, then Iraq for his second tour. Visible and invisible wounds that he carried quietly and secretly for decades. "Ms. Quinn," the prosecutor began, a young man with perfect teeth in a tailor-made suit, was repeatedly warned behind the Jefferson Street Cafe due to noise and disturbance. The owner filed 3 complaints this month. However, what the prosecutor did not mention was that Mason sat quietly behind the cafe, warming himself on the dust cover of the kitchen on particularly cold nights. He never begged for money, never disturbed the customers. He just looked for a moment of warmth when the December temperatures fell below freezing point. Officer James Reynolds, who had taken the arrest, said the following: "I found the defendant behind the cafe at 11:45 p.m. He refused to leave the premises when I called on him." Mason had not refused. He had simply asked for 5 more minutes to finish eating half the sandwich that the cook had secretly given him. But now a discussion seemed pointless, just like back then. "Your Honor," the prosecutor continued, "this is the 3rd report of the defendant this year. We recommend joint work and a 30-day house ban declaration for the business district of the city center." House ban would mean that Mason would no longer have access to the homeless shelter on 4th Street, the only warm bed he had known for months. It would also mean no more meals at St. Luke's Church on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It would mean true isolation in the coldest winter months. "Ms. Quinn," Judge Olivia Parker addressed him directly, "do you have a lawyer?" Mason shook his head. The defense attorney assigned to him was in another courtroom due to an emergency hearing. "Would you like to make a statement on your own behalf?" the judge asked, looking at her crescent-shaped reading glasses. Mason whispered. His voice sounded rusty due to the rare use. "No excuses, Your Honor. I'm just trying to stay warm." "Is there a special reason why you chose this place?" the judge asked further, an impenetrable expression on her face. "The cook." Mason hesitated. "Jimmy, he gives me food sometimes. I've known him since he was a child. His father served with me in the Gulf War." "And your military service?" asked Judge Parker, although this information was normally not relevant in such proceedings. "United States Marine Corps, 1975 to 1995, Staff Sergeant, 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines in Iraq." The words came automatically, a moment of clarity and pride in the midst of confusion. The judge took a note and then continued to look through the files. Something in Mason's personal file seemed to arouse her attention. But before she could speak again, the doors of the courtroom opened and a distinguishedly dressed man in an expensive suit entered the room. He went to the desk of the duty defender, put down a leather file bag, and turned to the court. "Your Honor, Alexander Rossi for the defendant. I apologize for the interruption, but I was commissioned to represent Mr. Quinn." Mason looked confused. He had not commissioned anyone. He could not afford a lawyer, not even one with such an expensive suit. "That is highly unusual," noted Judge Parker. "The court was not informed about this representation." "It is a very short-term development of Your Honor," Rossi replied calmly. I request a short interruption to speak with my client. Judge Parker looked at the lawyer, then Mason. Her expression was impenetrable. The court will make a 15-minute interruption, she announced and abruptly got up to go to her room. Mason turned to the stranger next to him. I have no money for a lawyer. You don't need that either, Rossi replied quietly. The office of Williams, Rossi, and Parker takes over your case pro bono. Mason wrinkled his forehead at the familiar name. Parker? Like the judge? Just like the judge, Rossi confirmed. In her arms, Judge Olivia Parker took off her glasses with trembling hands. For 20 years on the bench, they had taught her to keep her mind, no matter what came before her. But she had not prepared anything at that moment. That can't be the same man, she whispered, although the details fit too perfectly. She closed the drawer of her desk and took out a used photo. She herself as a young woman next to her brother, Lieutenant Jack Parker, in his Marine uniform. His arm lay around her shoulders, both laughed broadly at his promotion ceremony. Jack's last letter from Iraq was next to the photo, the paper thin of countless readings. In it he described a battle outside Fallujah, where his unit was under heavy fire. If it hadn't been Staff Sergeant Quinn, Jack had written, none of us would have made it. He ran over open terrain under heavy fire to help a fallen Marine. Then he gave cover fire so that the wounded could be evacuated. 2 weeks after writing this letter, Jack was killed by a bomb. Olivia remembered the military funeral, the folded flag that her parents were given, and the Marine who came to her afterwards. Her son saved my life, he said. I was the one he brought to safety before. The Marine had not finished the sentence. It was not necessary. The name of this Marine was Mason Quinn. Olivia had tried to contact him after the funeral. She wanted to know more about the last days of her brother, but the military explained that Sergeant Quinn had been sent back into action immediately. Later investigations revealed that he had been honorably released after a severe post-traumatic stress disorder and a traumatic brain injury during his last mission. And now, 20 years later, he was sitting in her courtroom, homeless, alone, unrecognized. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. Alexander? Rossi entered with a worried expression on his face. Olivia, what's going on? He asked. As a former law firm partner of her deceased husband and family friend, he was one of the few who mentioned her first name. He is Alex, she answered and showed the photo. The Marine who saved Jack's life, who carried him out under fire. Rossi's eyes widened as he made the connection. The homeless veteran in your courtroom, that's Mason Quinn, the one you've been trying to find for years? Olivia nodded. His service record confirms it. Fallujah 2004, same unit as Jack. For the action that Jack described in his letters, he was awarded the Silver Star. Does he know who you are? I don't think so. I married Thomas after law school and changed my name to Parker. It's been 20 years, she held in, gathered herself. What happened to him, Alex? How does a distinguished Marine become a homeless man who ends up in my courtroom just because he tries to warm up? Rossi shook his head. As far as I could take from our short conversation, he has been suffering from severe PTSD since his last mission. His wife left him while he was on duty. His claims to the Veterans Office ran amok in the bureaucratic mess. Worked on the construction site for years until his injuries forced him to stop. Then the typical course of events followed. Loss of a job, compulsory extension, ultimately the street. Olivia closed her eyes, remembered her brother's words. Quinn is the best of us. Someone who would give everything for his comrades without hesitation. If I only get half as good as him as an officer, then I was successful. What are you going to do? Rossi asked gently. You could explain yourself to prisoners. No, said Olivia determinedly. I won't let him disappear again. You know that there are ethical concerns. I am very aware of that, she replied, and resumed her position as a judge. But there are also ethical concerns about how we deal with those who have sacrificed everything for our country. When Judge Parker returned to the courtroom, her attitude was impeccable, her expression neutral. But those who knew her well might have noticed a slight tremor in her hands when she handed over the documents in front of her. Mr. Rossi, has your client decided how he wants to proceed? She asked with a formal tone. The lawyer appeared. Your Honor, we request the setting of all charges. My client has only tried to protect himself from life-threatening cold, a basic human need. In addition, we can prove that Ms. Quinn, with permission of the restaurant staff to stand on the premises, the prosecutor began to object. But Judge Parker raised his hand and brought him to silence before she took the floor. I have several questions for the defendants. She pointed her attention to Mason Quinn. Your military service records an operation in Fallujah in 2004, right? Mason stood up easily. Muscle memory from decades of military service overcame his current condition for a moment. Yes, Your Honor. 2nd Battalion, 8th Marines. We brought him to the medevac, answered Mason. His voice subsided. I later heard that he made it to Germany and went on patrol again a few weeks later. His vehicle was hit by an IED. Mason's voice was weak. All these years I've been wondering if I've done more harm than good to get him out of there, just so he'd die later. The silvery-haired Marine in the gallery jumped up, unable to hold back. That's him, he shouted. That's Staff Sergeant Quinn. I was there that day. He saved 6 of us. Judge Parker struck once with the hammer. Silence, she ordered, but her voice did not have the usual authority. The courtroom calmed down slowly, while tension in the air vibrated. Mason Quinn looked down, uncomfortable with the sudden attention. The silvery-haired Marine stood upright, despite himself. Your Honor, the prosecutor intervened, as honorable as Mr. Quinn's military service may be, he has no relevance to this case. The court sees it differently, interrupted Judge Parker. It has every relevance. She deliberately put the hammer down. This court will take a 10-minute break. Court officials, make sure Mr. Quinn stays in the courtroom. As she turned to leave, she held in and searched unusually for a judge, the eye contact with the defendant. Mr. Quinn, when I come back, there are things we need to discuss, things that go beyond this indictment. In her gestures, Olivia's professional facade finally collapsed. With trembling fingers, she pressed her hand on her lips to suppress emotions that had been waiting for her release for 20 years. After several deep breaths, she picked up the phone. Colonel Matthews? Olivia Parker. Yes, I know, it's been a long time. I need a favor. Immediately. When Judge Parker returned exactly 10 minutes later, she was not alone. 3 uniformed Marines entered the room behind her. A colonel, a master sergeant, and a corporal with a polished wooden box in their hands. The courtroom was rumbling. Whispering rushed through the ranks. Mason Quinn stood up reflexively, muscle memory despite physical complaints. Judge Parker sat down, looked into the overcrowded hall, and for the first time in her career, she took off her glasses and put them aside. She no longer spoke as a judge, but as a human being. Before we continue, I have to make a personal connection to this case. Lieutenant Jack Parker, who the defendant spoke of, was my brother. A audible roar went through the room. Mason opened his eyes, fluctuating between recognition and confusion. 20 years ago, my brother wrote to our family about a staff sergeant who saved his life in Fallujah, a man who ran through enemy fire to reach him after he had been injured and who gave further fire protection so that others could be safe. Her voice remained remarkably calm. This man was Sergeant Mason Quinn. The silvery-haired Marine from the gallery shouted, "It is true, Your Honor. I was there." Quinn was hit twice as he did. The lieutenant appeared to support Judge Parker, who thanked him with a nod. 2 weeks after that incident, my brother was killed in action, she began. At his funeral, several Marines came to our family to tell stories about Jack's courage, but also to tell us about the staff sergeant who had saved him during that former firefight. That gave us 2 more weeks with Jack, which we would otherwise never have had. She now saw Mason directly. After my brother's death, I tried to find her. Sergeant Quinn. The Marine Corps told me that they were back in action immediately. Years later, it was said that they had been honorably released, but I was not allowed to tell me where they were staying. Mason stood there completely unmoved. His weathered face was a mask of contradictory emotions. I never stopped looking, said Judge Parker. And now, By what can only be called fate or divine providence, they are standing here in my courtroom. She pointed to the sergeant who now appeared. Sergeant James Matthews was the commander of my brother. He has something to say. Sergeant Matthews appeared in front of the judge's desk. Staff Sergeant Quinn, the Marine Corps has been trying for years to find them. Their file was one of thousands that were reviewed as part of the Veteran Rehabilitation Initiative. New information about their service in Iraq and Afghanistan required a revaluation of their records and their claim to performance. A liberator appeared and opened the wooden case he was carrying. Inside, a medal shone on a blue ribbon. In the name of the Marine Minister, and in recognition of extraordinary bravery and determination, in the battle on April 17, 2004, Staff Sergeant Mason J. Quinn of the United States Marine Corps will hand over the Navy Cross. A shuddering murmur went through the courtroom. The Navy Cross is the second highest award of the U.S. Armed Forces after the Medal of Honor. Intelligence that was only recently released confirmed that their actions on that day not only saved Lieutenant Parker and 5 other Marines, but also perpetrated a setback that probably would have destroyed the entire convoy, said Chief Matthews. Their Silver Star was evaluated accordingly. Mason's stoic expression finally broke. That must be a mistake, he said. I only did my duty. No mistake, Sergeant, confirmed the chief. This honor is long overdue. A voice from the audience shouted, Attention! The silvery-haired Marine and several others in the courtroom, recognizable by their attitude even in civilian clothes, stood tight and saluted one another in front of Mason Quinn. One after the other stood up until finally everyone in the room stood up. Even the prosecutor, torn between protocol and human decency, stood up with clearly honest attention. Judge Parker, now with tears in her eyes, spoke with a trembling voice. In view of these circumstances, all charges against Staff Sergeant Mason Quinn will be dropped with prejudice. She struck with the judge's hammer. This court is closed. After the formalities were concluded, the Master Sergeant approached Mason with a tablet. Sir, we have tried to reach you to process your updated VA performance. Your degree of serviceability has been reevaluated to 100% service-related from the day of your release. What does that mean? Mason asked, still overwhelmed. That means considerable reimbursement, sir, as well as complete medical care, accommodation, and training if you want to use them. Alexander Rossi will step forward and our office will ensure that everything is processed immediately, Mr. Quinn. No further bureaucratic delays. From the back of the courtroom came Jimmy, the cook, who regularly brought Mason food, had tears in his eyes. My father always said there was a Marine who saved his entire unit, and he said, if I ever meet a Mason Quinn, I owe him everything. He stretched out his hand. I never would have thought that it was you all the time. The prosecutor, visibly moved, also stepped up to Mason. Sir, I had no idea. Please accept my apology for the way this case was handled. Mason stood in the middle of the sudden attention, with a posture that with every moment more dignity returned, as if the weight of unrecognized honor had finally been lifted off his shoulders. Judge Parker left the judge's desk, her professional distance removed. She stood before Mason. Her voice was gentle but clear. My brother wrote to me that you told him something when you brought him to safety. You said, no Marine stays back as long as I breathe. Today, Sergeant Quinn, we finally fulfill this promise, for you too. 2 weeks later, Mason Quinn stood in front of a mirror in an apartment from which he still could not believe that it belonged to him. The program for veterans had accelerated his case and put him in a one-room apartment in a complex, which was specially designed for former homeless veterans. The walls were barren, except for a framed object, the newly lost Navy Cross presented, in a showcase together with its original Purple Hearts and service badges, which Alexander Rossi had somehow retrieved from a warehouse box. A knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. Judge Olivia Parker stood in the hallway without her robe, with a small box in her hand. May I come in, Sergeant Quinn? She asked. Mason let her in, still a little overwhelmed by his new reality of life. Please, just Mason, Your Honors. Then I'm just Olivia, she answered with a small smile. At least outside my courtroom. They sat down, in the small living area. The helplessness of their unusual connection hung between them. "I brought something that I thought you might want to see," said Olivia, and opened the box from which she took a bundle of letters. "These are from Jack. He wrote to our family every week while he was on duty." She handed Mason a letter. "This one here mentions her in particular. He was written the day after the incident when they saved him." Mason's hands trembled slightly as he unfolded the paper. Lieutenant Parker's handwriting was neat and precise, just as Mason had it in his memory from the operations reports. "Mom and Dad," he read aloud, "don't worry about what you hear in the news. I'm fine thanks to one of our NCOs. Staff Sergeant Quinn did something yesterday that I still can't believe. When our unit was hit, he moved through fire that would have knocked down everyone else. He didn't let me go even when I told him to. He said no Marine stays behind under my watch." Mason's voice echoed. "He often wrote about them," said Olivia quietly. "He said they were the Marine he would have liked to be himself." "He was a good officer," answered Mason. "Young, but he took care of his men. That's rare. After we lost Jack, I went to the law faculty," said Olivia, and made a gesture towards the apartment. "All this here, the Veterans Court program, the housing initiative, began because of what Jack wrote about her. About how the system sometimes leaves its heroes in the lurch." Mason looked away, uncomfortable with so much recognition. "I'm not a hero. I just did what had to be done." "Heroes always say that," said Olivia gently. She hesitated for a moment, then drove on. "There is still something you should know. On the day Jack died, he led a patrol to track down a rebel group that had targeted civilians. He had voluntarily signed up for this mission. His last letter to us said that he was trying to be fair to the example that they had given him. This revelation hit Mason harder than any physical blow. For 20 years he had carried the burden of survival with him, wondering whether saving the lieutenant had not only delayed the inevitable, whether his efforts in the chaos of the war had made any difference at all. "He didn't die because of them," said Olivia, as if she could read his thoughts. "He lived like that. Because of them." They sat there silently, two people, bound by loss and honor for decades. Outside, the snow began to fall gently and covered the city in a quiet white. "Finally," Mason said, his voice hardly more than a whisper. "All these years on the street, I thought no one would remember that all this didn't mean anything in the end. It meant everything," said Olivia. "For Jack, for the other Marines, for me." When she was getting ready to go, Olivia gently put her hand on Mason's shoulder. "Jack always said that the true value of a Marine is not what he does when everyone is watching, but what he does when no one is watching. You have lived this truth, even when the world was gone." Mason stood more upright than for years. A quiet dignity returned to his posture. "Someone remembered my name," he simply said. After all this time, someone remembered. In this quiet moment, something long broken began to heal, not only for Mason Quinn, but for everyone who was touched by his unrecognized honor. Some people save others from death, but spend their whole life saving themselves from being forgotten by no one. Honor needs no glory. Sometimes a moment of recognition is enough to help someone to stand with their head held high again. I don't want anyone to be left behind. Everyone deserves to be heard and respected. If you believe that, comment "respect" to show that you stand on the side of goodness and justice. Don't forget to subscribe to Heartstrings Radio to spread more stories that touch the heart.